Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and as always, welcome back to another lore-oriented video. And this is one that I've been very excited to talk about for a while, with us approaching the final character of the Kombat pack. That means that we are in the month of my most anticipated character of the Kombat pack, Takeda Takahashi, son of Kenshi and former protege to Hanzo Hasashi, but with him still being a relatively new character, as his last appearance was back in MKX, released in 2015. I thought, what better way could we celebrate his return than cover his entire lineage throughout the Mortal Kombat franchise, as we hear so much about their line, but it's one shrouded in mystery. The legacy of the Takahashis is something that their successors are built upon. It's the foundation for how they rise. So today, we will be taking a step back through time, analyze their lineage, their fall from grace, the mysteries surrounding Sento, and of course, every known descendant tied to them. So just a heads up as well, this is going to be part breakdown analysis as well as parts theory, as we'll be touching on topics only kind of glossed over and left largely unexplored. Plus, with us jumping from timeline to timeline to timeline, I will be touching on how they've slowly changed and evolved from era to era. But before we do begin, if you like these sort of deep analyses, please do give this video a thumbs up, as one, it goes a very long way here, and two, if you like it, I may wind up turning it into a small little mini-series on the channel, as I do find it to be quite an interesting topic to analyze, especially with the vast variety of characters and unexplored ideas in the series. So if you want to stick around, please do consider subscribing to see more. Anyway, let's dive into things. Now, the Takahashi line would make their first appearance in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance in the form of the newly introduced character Kenshi Takahashi, the blind swordsman and most recent successor of their line. The Takahashis were known to be an ancient line of proud warrior kings, living in a kingdom that blended elements of both Eastern and Western cultures. They thrived for an unknown disclosed amount of time, but unfortunately at some point, they would lose their power, with the only relic that was left of their empire being Sento. Now, not very much would be added in terms of lore for the reboot trilogy, but in the new era, additional layers would be added to the Takahashi line, fleshing out what had become of them during this time. According to Kenshi's bio for Mortal Kombat 1, the Takahashis would now derive from Japan, being held up in very high esteem amongst its people. That is, of course, until the empire fell. As to who, well, that's the mystery. Stripped of their fortune, royalty, and power, the clan would seek safety in the hands of the Bakuto, the predecessors to the Yakuza. Thus, in Mortal Kombat 1, Kenshi sought out Sento in the hopes of restoring his name and his clan. Now, if I am gonna put my nerd cap on here, the oldest recorded date of the Bakuto is the 17th century, with them later changing their name in the 18th century to obviously the Yakuza. Because of this, it allows us to pinpoint that the Takahashi's downfall must have happened somewhere between the 17th and 18th century, during Edo period Japan. As for who was responsible for this, that's quite hard to say, as quite a few notable battles happen around this time. There also is the possibility that the Takahashis simply could have imploded from within, maybe having been caused from infighting within the clan. But alas, this is a theory, but one that I will say is cemented in the same reality which Mortal Kombat does reflect. So this of course brings me on to the legendary mysterious sword Sento, and this weapon in particular is a very unique one, even amongst the wide arsenal of Mortal Kombat. To the naked eye, Sento just looks like any other katana, but that's the beauty of its simplicity, as Sento acts as a sentient vessel, housing an endless sea of souls from the Takahashi dynasty. Very little is known of its creation, or how it came to obtain its mystical properties, only that it does have it. And I think there may actually be a bit more going on with Sento than we've previously understood. But again, that's purely hypothetical on my part, and something I will touch on a little later on. Moving back over to Sento, this is an ancient blade that has been passed down the line of the Takahashis. As for who made it, when it was forged, is still a complete mystery to this day. We only know that in the fall of the clan, it would be dropped into the Well of Souls, which, just so coincidentally, also housed their previous wielders. So it could be very possible that this was the way Sento was embodied with such powerful magics. It's never made clear, but it's an interesting theory for its source of power. In the reboot trilogy though, this idea would be expanded on in a pretty big way, as not only could the blade guide Kenshi, but here, greatly assist him in battle via astral form or through possession, something that's largely reflected through his gameplay. We'll get to that. The new era version of Sento though is quite different in that regard, because unlike its predecessor, instead of being sealed away and cast in a sea of souls, it would be a powerful relic lost to time and hunted down by Kenshi, meaning that possibly he already knew of the weapon's abilities this time around. Thus the blade here is quite different in nature, and it looks like it gains its magical abilities by other means, as his ancestors have already been sealed away within it. From what we're aware of Sento is that it could very well predate the Takahashis. Again, the details surrounding its creation is a mystery, but it raises so many questions around it that simply haven't been asked. Whilst, yes, it has been commonly used as a weapon for good, that doesn't mean that every individual sealed away in it did it justice. Because within Sento, there is one figure that stands out from the rest, and that's a demonic ancestor from the possessed variation. This is a figure that can only be summoned once Sento is shattered into fragments, and with the somewhat seal broken on the blade, it brings forth a very sinister figure from its steel, and unlike its blue counterparts, does take on a dark samurai mist form, which then raises the question of, is there more than meets the eye with Sento here? You see, there's a reoccurring pattern throughout the Takahashi line, one where nearly every wielder of the blade does go blind. We see that happen with Kenshi, an unnamed female ancestor, and even the figures who Kenshi summons has their eyes bandaged. The common denominator here is that they've all wielded Sento, with only 2 members of them having not gone blind. The first is the demonic figure we know very little of, and Takeda himself, who is yet to wield the blade. But that hasn't stopped him from very nearly losing his eyesight in MKX. It's kind of impossible to ignore here, as it does show signs that Sento may be hexed in some way. It's also very possible that Sento may be a demonic blade forged from the Netherrealm that did wind up on the mortal plane, which kind of does explain the cost it takes to use it. But to wield such power, it would come at the toll of their eyesight. And if my theory is right in some way, shape and form, it may actually explain why Sento is bound to the Takahashi line, as it's only passed from generation to generation. Plus, let's not forget that whatever wielder of the blade perishes is then bound to the sword. So you can probably understand where I'm coming from here. Now let's move on to the Takahashi line itself, and every figure we currently know of, starting off with the ancestral spirits. In terms of spectres conjured by Sento, we do have a few to touch on here, with the first being one conjured from Balanced, which bears a physical resemblance to that of Kenshi himself. Personally, I don't believe this to be a singular figure, but more so an amalgamation of them that Kenshi channels through attacks instead of allowing them to possess him. Hence how the projection itself looks very similar to Kenshi and is merely a spiritual extension of his physical being. In Kenjutsu, we do get a bit of a change here, as this is a form and variation that allows him to channel one of his ancestors into combat, one that specializes in sword combat of the same name. In terms of narrative, lore, and history, very little is known outside of combat. But I do have a sneaking suspicion that this is the same figure summoned in MK1 when Kenshi utilizes Sento stance, as aesthetically, it is eerily similar to the Ronin costume from MKX. The main difference here, of course, being that one is blindfolded, whereas the other isn't, a byproduct of the variation system itself. Our next figure here, and arguably the most interesting to me, is the Demon Samurai. Now, I do want to point out that there has been no main story or narrative significance with this variation, as it's more so something explored and expressed through gameplay than something strictly tied to a story. But the importance of its inclusion shows that not quite everything was so cut and dry, as even this figure himself could have actually been the one responsible for their downfall. Moving on to our next character here, we do have a mysterious unnamed female figure that's only briefly seen during MKX. This particular Takahashi is one held up in a mural dedicated to the fallen heroes of Mortal Kombat, meaning that at some point prior to Kenshi, that their line more than likely bared close ties to Raiden. And with her holding Sento, it does mean that this all does occur before their downfall. I mean, hell, this could also be the very figure that is responsible for casting Sento into a well. And yet again, of course, a distinct feature of this fighter is that this is yet another Takahashi blinded whilst utilizing Sento. Outside of this mural though, very little was known about her, as she's never seen again, mentioned, or even given a name. Moving on to the most well-known figure now, we do of course have Kenshi Takahashi, and there's two mainline incarnations of this character. The original that spanned from Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance all the way to X, and then his current version of the new era. The original version of Kenshi was a talented fighter, seeking glory, greatness, and recognition. Such achievements naturally put a chip on his shoulder, but such talent did not go unnoticed, as one day he would be recognized by an old man, Song, who goaded him into reclaiming the ancient weapon Sento, stroking his ego, saying that a great warrior deserves a great weapon. So as expected, Kenshi would take the bait. With the well cracked open, the eruption of souls that burst forth blinded him, and it's revealed here that the old man's Song was in fact Shang Tsung in disguise, seeking souls to feast upon from the well. Here, Kenshi is left broken, defeated, and blind. It was only by chance of fate that Kenshi found salvation in Sento, as his ancestors would guide him moving forward. In the new era, things would be slightly tweaked in different areas, as once their bloodline fell, they would of course fall into the care of the Bakuto, which in turn meant that Kenshi was raised in the ways of the Yakuza, being a ruthless enforcer and operative amongst their ranks. Eventually, this brought him to a crossroads in his life, one which reflected on his fallen dynasty and how they lost their way. It's here where his gaze would fall upon the ancestral blade, and believed that by obtaining it, he could liberate his family. Fortunately, in this timeline, it wouldn't be sealed in a well, but instead held onto by Johnny Cage, so Kenshi would obtain it by other means. However, the curse of sight would continue to plague him in the present. It would be by the hand of Melina, who at the time was caught in a Tarkart frenzied rage. And finally, of course, this brings us onto our last character, and the youngest addition to their line, Takeda Takahashi, child of Kenshi and Suchin. Born in secrecy, Takeda's life is one that lingered in the shadows, as Kenshi believed for his family's protection, he had to distance himself from them, as working undercover naturally put him in the crosshairs of many. And unfortunately, he was correct, because once he was sussed out by the Red Dragons, Suchin would be killed and Takeda would be on the run. With limited options left, Kenshi would be forced to put him in the care of the former Scorpion, Hanzo Hasashi, alleviated of his Spectre mantle, and with a very new take on life, Hanzo would teach Takeda in the ways of the Shirai Ryu, honing his skills and turn him into a formidable fighter, ones that blended both his heritage and his Shirai style. In time, him and his father would eventually reconcile, turning their gaze towards the Red Dragons for vengeance. Now, for how this translates over into the new era, things look to be very different with Takeda from the ground up, as he's no longer Kenshi's son, but instead his cousin for this new era. Because of that, a lot of character relationships really do change here. In this very new and very different present, Takeda, much like Kenshi, did serve under the likes of the Yakuza. He took their orders and executed their crimes with no hesitation. But when Kenshi broke away, it fell to Takeda to take him out. Despite his raw talent and youth, Takeda was unable to best Kenshi. Kenshi wished to salvage their relationship by having him heal and stay at the Shirai Ryu, eventually in time turning him against the Yakuza. With that said, this has been it for my coverage of the Takahashi line, discussing their fall from grace, the deviations and tweaks from timeline to timeline, the nature of Sento and the mystery surrounding it, as well as every known figure associated with their dynasty. But one thing I feel this video highlighted is that there's a lot of questions left unanswered. If you have any suggestions, please do comment down below, as I'd love to hear what you have to say. Well, for now everyone, that's been it for me. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.